Hi, friend. Close the door on the noise of the modern world for a moment. Find a comfortable spot, and let's go on a journey together. Tonight we are stepping backward 2,000 years into the dark, quiet expanse of the Roman Empire. But we aren't visiting the marble palaces of the emperors or the grand spectacles of the Colosseum. Instead, you and I are putting on traveling cloaks, strapping daggers to our belts and stepping out onto the open road. We are about to discover what traveling across the ancient world actually felt like, away from the clean history books. We will feel the dust of the endless basalt highways, navigate the lawless shadows of deep alpine forests, and step inside the filthy, flickering light of muddy roadside inns that the elite Romans desperately warned. Imagine you are standing at the exact center of the city of Rome 2,000 years ago. Right there, in the middle of the crowded, noisy Roman Forum, is a giant monument covered in gleaming bronze. It's called the Golden Milestone. If you walk up to it and wipe away the city dust, you won't see pretty statues. Instead, you'll find a list of numbers. These numbers tell you the exact distance from this very spot to every single major gate of the city, and from those gates, out to the furthest edges of the known world. This monument is the physical reason for that famous old saying, "All roads lead to Rome." But if you actually decided to step onto one of these roads at sunrise, you had to leave your romantic ideas behind. Today, we look at history books and see neat, clean lines connecting empires on a map. It looks like a fun summer road trip. In reality, stepping onto a Roman highway was a bit of a psychological shock. You were leaving the safe, cozy brick walls of the city and surrendering your body to an endless, unyielding ribbon of stone that sliced through wild mountains and empty deserts for thousands of miles. And when I say straight lines, I mean it. Roman engineers were completely obsessed with straight paths. They had a flat-out refusal to compromise with nature. If a massive mountain stood in the way, they didn't take the easy route and curve around it. Nope. They used iron tools to chop a terrifying flat shelf right through the granite face. If a muddy swamp threatened to block the path, they didn't look for a detour. They drove thousands of heavy oak wood piles deep into the slime, built a massive stone bridge over it, and kept marching forward. This gave the roads a slightly unnatural feel. The highway was a loud declaration of power. It was Rome's way of saying to the earth, "We are in charge now, and you will move for the emperor." The ultimate over-engineering. The soundtrack of your entire journey was a constant rhythmic clack, clack, clack. That was the sound of iron-rimmed wooden wheels and heavy leather boots hitting solid volcanic stone. It was a hypnotic noise that could easily drive you crazy after 10 hours of walking. But it was only possible because of a level of engineering that was honestly a bit ridiculous. A Roman highway wasn't just a dirt path cleared of weeds. It was a deeply buried underground monument of human sweat. Before anyone could lay down a single paving stone, the Roman army would dig a massive trench into the earth until they found solid bedrock. If the soil was too sandy or soft, they would ram wooden poles into the ground to stiffen it up. Once the trench was ready, the workers followed a strict 4-layer blueprint that made these roads practically indestructible. The statumen. This was the heavy base layer. Slaves and soldiers packed a thick foundation of rough hand-sized rocks mixed with mud to create a solid foundation that wouldn't shift under pressure. The rudus. Next, they poured a 9-inch layer of broken pottery pieces, gravel, and rough stones, all glued together with a lime mortar. This was, basically, an early form of super tough concrete. The nucleus. The third layer was a fine, hand-rammed mix of small gravel, chalk, and clay. This acted like a shock-absorbing mattress for the heavy traffic that would pass above. The summum dorsum. This was the top layer you actually walked on. It was made of massive, multi-sided volcanic basalt blocks. Stonemasons cut these blocks so perfectly that they fit together like a puzzle, leaving almost no gaps between them. If you look down at these paving stones, you would notice something brilliant. The road wasn't perfectly flat. It was built with a gentle curve, meaning the middle of the road was slightly higher than the edges. When the violent winter rainstorms broke over the landscape, the water didn't pool on the track to create a muddy mess. Instead, it instantly ran off the sides into deep, parallel drainage ditches. Because of this, even in a total downpour, the Roman road stayed dry, solid, and completely open for business. It was built to last for hundreds of years, totally indifferent to the weather. Number: navigating by the text. So you're out on the road, your legs are starting to ache, and you want to know how far it is to the next town. Today, you just pull out your phone and look at a map. But to an ancient Roman, geography was viewed in a completely different way. They didn't care about the true visual shape of land masses or mountains. They understood the world as a simple, linear list of destinations. If you were a wealthy merchant or an official traveler, you would carry an itinerarium in your bag. This wasn't a map with realistic borders. It was a long, narrow roll of papyrus that you unrolled piece by piece as you moved along. The most famous example we have today is over 22 feet long but only a foot wide. When you look at it, the world looks totally squished and weird. The Mediterranean Sea is just a thin blue line. Italy is stretched out like a piece of dough, and mountain ranges look like little cartoon drawings. But to the traveler on the ground, this didn't matter at all. The itinerarium was entirely practical. It worked just like a modern subway map. It didn't care about the true curves of the rivers. All it did was tell you the single line you were on, the name of the road, the next town ahead where to find fresh water, and the exact distance to the next stop down to the single mile. As you walked, your only real connection to civilization was a series of stone pillars known as miliaria, the Roman milestones. Every 1,000 paces, which the Romans measured as the distance a soldier's left foot hit the ground 500 times, a massive stone cylinder was sunk deep into the earth. These pillars stood over 6 feet tall and weighed thousands of pounds. Approaching one of these milestones in the quiet of the afternoon, you would wipe away the white dust to read the deep Latin letters carved into the stone. The text didn't just give you a cold number. It was a heavy piece of political advertising. It listed the full, exhausting name and titles of the emperor who paid for the road, the name of the legion that dug the dirt, and finally, the distance. MP 22, 22 miles to the next city. To a lonely traveler moving through an unfamiliar province thousands of miles from home, these stones were a weirdly comforting sight. Every single mile the pillar told you that the emperor was still in charge, Roman law still existed, and you were still firmly hooked into that golden monument back in the capital city. You were small, the landscape was giant, but the stone system beneath your feet was absolute. If you think dealing with modern airport security or the local DMV is a nightmare, you wouldn't last 5 minutes on a Roman highway without the right paperwork. Once you stepped off the streets of Rome and onto the open road, you quickly realized that the empire wasn't a free-for-all sandbox where anyone could just wander around. It was a massive, tightly controlled system. The roads were built with precision, but they were also wrapped in thick layers of invisible imperial red tape. The moment you arrived at a major junction or a provincial border, you would encounter a roadside checkpoint. Standing in the middle of the stone path was a group of stationarii, military police officers whose entire job was to glare at travelers, look at bags, and demand identification. If you were just an ordinary citizen trying to move some wool to the next market town, you had to step aside into the dirt. But if you were an important state official, an imperial courier, or a super-wealthy merchant with friends in high places, you would reach into your leather pouch and pull out the ultimate golden ticket of the ancient world. The diploma. This wasn't a paper booklet like a modern passport. The diploma was a heavy, two-leaved bronze or wooden tablet that folded together like a small book. It was issued directly by the emperor himself or a high-ranking provincial governor. The front of the tablet was covered in a thick layer of dark beeswax, into which the official's heavy metal signet ring had been pressed, while the wax was still hot and runny. When you handed this tablet over to the border officer, he wouldn't just read the words. He would lean down, bring the wax close to his nose, and take a deep sniff. The distinct smell of melted beeswax, smoky wood fire, and old papyrus was the authentic scent of imperial power. If the seal was cracked, smeared, or looked fake, you were immediately dragged off the road for a very unpleasant interrogation. But if the seal was perfect, the guard's tough attitude vanished instantly. He would bow, clear the path, and hand you the keys to the entire empire. The ultimate premium membership, possessing a valid diploma, basically meant you were traveling through the ancient world on the highest possible VIP tier. It gave you full access to the cursus publicus, the state-run transport and communication network. This system wasn't built to help regular people see the world. It was created so the emperor could send commands and receive news across thousands of miles before a rebellion could spark. With that bronze tablet in your hand, your journey transformed from a painful foot slog into a high-speed sprint. Every 10 to 12 miles along the road, you would see a clean, well-guarded compound known as a mutatio. These were imperial changing stations. The moment you rode in, a team of enslaved stable hands would run out to grab your sweaty, tired horse. Within 90 seconds, they would transfer your bags onto a fresh, fully rested stallion, hand you a cup of clean water, and send you on your way. By changing horses 5 or 6 times a day, an imperial courier could easily cover 50 to 60 miles in a single day. In emergencies, some legendary riders covered over 100 miles in 24 hours. To an ordinary Roman walking on foot, this looked like absolute magic. It was the ancient version of watching a private jet zoom over your head while you are stuck in a bumper-to-bumper traffic jam on the highway. And the perks didn't stop at the stables. When the sun began to drop behind the hills and the road grew dark, the diploma holders didn't have to look for a sketchy roadside ditch to sleep in. They pulled into a mansion. These were elite, state-run hotels spaced about 25 miles apart, the distance of a standard day's travel. Inside the thick stone walls of a mansion, life was incredibly comfortable. There were private, heated bathhouses where you could wash away the white road dust, clean beds without bedbugs, and kitchens staffed by professional chefs cooking up fine imported wines and roast meats on the emperor's official tab. There was even a repair shop on site with blacksmiths and wagon builders ready to fix your wheels while you slept. It was a secure, clean oasis of pure luxury, cutting through the wild, dangerous countryside. The view from the dirt. But let's be real for a second. You probably didn't have a diploma. Unless you were a personal buddy of the emperor, you were part of the other 99% of travelers who had to experience the Roman road system from the absolute bottom up. For the ordinary person, the cursus publicus was something you watched from a distance with a mix of awe and deep frustration. If an ordinary traveler tried to walk into a mansion to buy a hot meal or rent a room, the guards at the gate would literally laugh in their face and push them back into the street with the blunt end of a spear. The luxury hotels were strictly for the elite. Regular folks had to keep walking until they found a copona, a cheap, filthy roadside tavern that usually doubled as a house of ill repute. Instead of a fresh, fast stallion, the ordinary merchant or family traveled using heavy, two-wheeled wooden carts pulled by a team of slow, stubborn oxen. Oxen didn't trot. They walked at a miserable pace of about 2 miles per hour. The heavy wooden wheels didn't have rubber tires or metal springs, so every single bump and crack in the basalt paving blocks shot a violent, bone-rattling shudder straight up your spine. As you crept along at this agonizingly slow speed, you had to constantly stay alert. If you heard the distant, rapid thump-thump-thump of galloping hooves behind you, you had to instantly steer your slow ox cart off the solid. stones, and into the muddy ditch at the side of the road. If you didn't move fast enough, the imperial couriers or a passing column of Roman legionaries would simply ram your cart out of the way, curse at you in Latin, and keep flying forward. On the Roman highway, the class divide wasn't just about how much money you had in your purse. It was measured by the speed at which you moved and the quality of the air you breathed. The elites rode high, smelling of fine wine and clean linen, while the rest of the empire walked down below in the dust, watching the bronze seals of the emperor fade away over the next distant hill. Before you could ever take your very first step out onto the smooth basalt stones of the highway, you had to face a pretty heavy reality check. There were no digital bank accounts, no emergency roadside assistance apps, and no convenience stores waiting around the corner to sell you a fresh water bottle or a phone charger. When you left the outer gates of a Roman town, you were essentially stepping into a giant, unpredictable void. If your wooden wagon wheel snapped in half on a lonely mountain pass, or if you ran out of food while crossing a dry limestone plain, nobody was coming to save you. You were only as safe as the items packed inside your luggage. Because of this, packing for a long journey 2,000 years ago was a serious, slow-motion operation. It was less about packing cute outfits for a vacation and more about assembling a mini mobile life support capsule. The night before a trip, the typical Roman house was filled with a very specific set of sounds and smells. You would hear the heavy, solid thud of thick wooden chests being slammed shut and latched with iron padlocks. The air inside the room would instantly fill with the sharp, greasy smell of olive oil-treated leather cloaks and the dry, dusty aroma of butylatum, the universal traveling bread of the ancient world. The literal weight of your wallet. The absolute biggest puzzle you had to solve before leaving was the money situation. Today, if you travel across the country, your money is completely invisible, sitting safely on a tiny plastic card or inside your phone. But in the ancient world, if you wanted to buy a hot bowl of stew or pay for a spot to sleep at an inn, you had to bring physical heavy metal, silver denarii and bronze sesterces. This created a massive, terrifying catch-22. To survive a 6-month trip, you needed a lot of cash, but carrying a huge bag of metal coins made you a walking target for every single bandit hiding in the bushes along the highway. If someone heard the loud jingle-jingle of coins bouncing inside your linen pouch while you stopped to water your horse at a public well, you might as well have signed your own death warrant. To keep their cash from getting them killed, Romans had to get pretty clever with how they hid their wealth. Instead of carrying a loose purse on their hip, serious travelers wore a specialized leather money belt called a zona. This belt was strapped tightly around your bare waist, completely hidden deep beneath the thick folds of your woolen tunic. The belt was divided into small, tight, separate pockets, designed to hold the coins perfectly flat against your skin. This compressed the metal and stopped the coins from clinking together like tiny bells with every step you took. If you were a big-time merchant moving giant amounts of silver to buy a shipment of grain, you had to pack the coins into heavy oak chests reinforced with thick iron straps. These chests were dumped at the absolute bottom of your transport wagon, entirely covered by heavy canvas tarps, dirty grain sacks, and regular camping gear just so nobody at a customs checkpoint or a roadside tavern would guess how rich you actually were. Truer, gear for the body and the soul. Once your cash was hidden, you had to pack your weapons against the weather. The Mediterranean is famous for being sunny and beautiful, but if you have ever stood on an open plain in the middle of November during a downpour, you know that the cold can kill you just as fast as a robber's blade. Your number one shield against the elements was the pennula, a massive, thick traveling cloak made of heavy wool or greasy leather. It had a giant, integrated hood that you could pull tight over your face. The wool was heavily treated with animal fats or olive oil to make it naturally water-resistant, turning the cloak into a walking waterproof tent that kept your core body heat trapped inside. Next went the food rations. No experienced Roman traveler trusted the sketchy, overpriced food sold by roadside vendors. Instead, you packed a massive supply of busallatum. This was a basic bread that was baked twice at a very low temperature for hours until every single drop of moisture was completely gone. It was as hard as a concrete brick, but it could last for months without ever growing mold. To actually eat it without breaking your teeth, you had to smash it into chunks with a rock and soak it in a cup of water or sour wine until it dissolved into a thick, filling mush. Finally, you packed your tools for basic survival. You rolled up a sturdy leather water skin to keep your liquids cool, and a compact tinderbox filled with a chunk of flint, a piece of steel, and some dry, charred linen to start fires in empty fields. You also strapped a sharp iron dagger openly to your hip. Carrying weapons inside the city limits of Rome was completely illegal. But on the open road, an exposed blade was a necessary social signal. It told everyone watching that you were fully prepared to fight for your life. But Romans didn't just rely on iron and leather. They also needed spiritual insurance. Tucked away into the softest, safest corner of your pack were the lares viales, tiny clay or bronze statues of the guardian gods of the road. Every night, whether you were sleeping under the stars or inside a crowded, noisy tavern, you would take these little statues out, set them by your head, and light a small bronze oil lamp to keep the deep, terrifying darkness of the ancient countryside at bay. You packed your money, your food, your blade, and your gods, hoping it would be exactly enough to bring you back home alive. There is a very specific kind of trance that takes over your mind when you spend weeks walking down a Roman road. It's not the exciting, action-packed adventure you see in movies. It's slow, it's hypnotic. It's a repetitive, rhythmic loop that stretches out from the moment the sun peaks over the horizon until it sinks back down into the dirt. Your entire universe shrinks down to a simple, endless pattern. The lifting of your left foot, the planting of your right foot, and the steady, crunching drag of your leather sandals over thousands of perfectly fitted basalt blocks. If you were a traveler on a budget, you weren't speeding along on a majestic horse. You were moving at the universal speed limit of the ancient world, 3 miles per hour. That was it. Whether you were a poor farmer, a wealthy merchant in a slow-moving carriage, or a tough Roman soldier carrying a 60-pound pack, 3 miles per hour was the natural tempo of the empire. At first, that speed feels incredibly slow, almost annoying. But as the hours bleed together into days, your body stops fighting the slow pace and adjusts to it. You fall into the steady march, your breathing matching the heavy collective stomp of the people around you, and the road becomes a strange kind of home. The baking of the wool. By noon, the pleasant coolness of the morning is completely gone, replaced by a heavy, dry Mediterranean heat that bounces right off the pale stone highway. This is where the physical reality of Roman fashion hits you. We always see ancient statues looking crisp, white, and beautifully clean. But out here on the road, hot sun and heavy wool clothing do not mix well. If you were trying to look fancy or official, you might be wearing a traditional tunic or a heavy cloak. Within a few miles, that thick wool starts to bake in the sun, trapping your body heat and smelling strongly of wet sheep and old sweat. Your skin gets itchy, your shoulders ache where your bag straps dig in, and every breeze feels like a blast from a hot oven. But the heat is only half the battle. The real enemy of the road is the dust. Imagine thousands of leather-soled sandals, heavy iron-rimmed wagon wheels, and stubborn pack mules all grinding against the volcanic stones hour after hour. They crush the tiny bits of dirt and dried mud into a superfine, powdery white chalk. With every single step the crowd takes, a thick, blinding cloud of this white dust kicks up into the air, hovering about waist-high over the highway. It coats everything. It gets stuck to your sweaty arms, turns your eyebrows completely white, and makes your teeth feel gritty when you chew your dry traveling rations. You learn very quickly to wrap a linen scarf tightly around your mouth and nose, breathing in your own hot air, just to keep your lungs from filling up with the pulverized remains of the Italian countryside. The 6-foot headstone of the mile. Just when the physical exhaustion starts to make your legs feel like solid lead, you see a shape looming up out of the white dust cloud ahead. It's a millenarium, a Roman milestone. These aren't tiny, cute little signs like we have on highways today. A Roman milestone is a massive, solid cylinder of limestone or marble, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than a couple of oxen. They look less like traffic signs and more like heavy stone headstones cutting through the landscape. When you finally trudge up to the pillar, you lean your tired back against the cool stone and read the big, deeply carved Latin letters. As we learned back in Chapter 1, these milestones are essentially giant political advertisements for the emperor. The text spends 80% of its space listing the ruler's exhausting official titles, bragging about which wars he won, and reminding you exactly who paid the soldiers to lay these stones. But at the very bottom, beneath all the imperial bragging, you find the one number you actually care about: the distance. It might say MP15, meaning 15 miles from the nearest city gate. You look down at your swollen feet, do the math in your head, and realize you still have 5 miles of heavy walking left before you can drop your bag and find a place to sleep. The straight line mind game. While the physical toll of walking 20 miles a day is brutal, it's the mental game that really tests your sanity. Because Roman engineers were totally obsessed with creating perfectly straight paths, the road ahead of you doesn't curve, dip, or hide behind interesting hills. It just stretches out in a mathematically perfect flat line directly toward the horizon. You can look up and see the exact spot you will be walking through 2 hours from now. It feels like you are on a giant, slow-motion treadmill. You walk for an hour, your knees aching and your throat dry, but when you look up, the horizon looks exactly the same as it did when you started. The line of stone never seems to end, and it starts to play weird tricks on your brain. To keep from losing their minds to the boring routine, travelers fell into a quiet, shared rhythm. People didn't talk much during the heat of the day. They saved their breath. Instead, you would listen to the steady, hypnotic cadence of the march, the rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of sandals on grit, the slow creaking of the wooden wagon axles, and the dull thud of livestock hooves became a weirdly soothing song. Your thoughts start to drift away from the pain in your muscles and the dust in your throat. You stop worrying about how far away the city is or how bad your wool tunic smells. You simply dissolve into the ancient flow of the empire, matching your steps to the person in front of you, moving forward 1,000 paces at a time until the long straight line finally dips into the evening shadows. If you ever find yourself sitting in your car during a brutal rush-hour gridlock, cursing the modern world and wishing you could escape to a simpler time, I have some bad news for you. The ancient Roman highways were not peaceful, empty paths cutting through quiet meadows. The moment you joined the main flow of a major imperial road, you were stepping directly into a chaotic, loud, and incredibly slow-moving traffic jam that stretched for hundreds of miles. The main difference between then and now: modern traffic smells like car exhaust and gasoline. Roman traffic smelled like sweaty oxen, wet wool, and cheap garlic stew. The soundtrack of this ancient gridlock was a wild, exhausting wall of sound that could give you a headache within 20 minutes. The loudest noise by far was the deep, agonizing groan of ungreased wooden wagon axles. Because metal was expensive, most regular transport carts were built entirely out of wood. When you loaded 3,000 pounds of grain or olive oil barrels onto a wooden axle and pulled it across solid stone paving blocks at 2 miles per hour, the friction created a high-pitched, screaming screech that sounded like a dying monster. Now, multiply that sound by 50 wagons all stuck in a row, and you get a sense of the daily road music, the imperial melting pot. To make things even more chaotic, the people shouting over this noise weren't just speaking standard Latin. The Roman road system was the great melting pot of the ancient world. If you stopped to let a wagon pass at a narrow bridge, you would hear teamsters cursing at their stubborn mules in a dozen different languages and regional accents. You'd hear a smooth Greek merchant arguing with a border tax collector, a hairy Celtic trader from the northern forests yelling at his oxen, a North African merchant shouting in Old Punic, and a tough Roman soldier barking orders in rapid-fire street-level Latin. It was a giant moving tower of Babel on wheels, and everybody was completely annoyed with everybody else. Every single person on that stone highway was locked into a fierce, unspoken battle for space. The road was only about 15 to 20 feet wide, which meant there was barely enough room for two standard-sized wagons to pass each other without scraping their sides. If a massive, heavy-duty shipping cart ran into a breakdown or dropped a wheel into a drainage ditch, the entire highway for 3 miles behind it ground to a complete dead stop. There were no tow trucks to call, so everyone else just had to sit around in the baking sun, screaming obscenities in 5 languages until the broken cart could be manually lifted out of the way. The Great Roadside Divide. As you moved along in this slow-motion crawl, you quickly learned that the highway had a very strict social hierarchy. You could tell exactly how important a person was just by looking at how high their feet were off the actual stone paving blocks. At the absolute top of this food chain were the high-ranking politicians and wealthy Roman senators. These guys didn't walk, and they definitely didn't ride in bumpy, bone-shattering wooden carts. Instead, they traveled in a lectica, a luxurious, enclosed litter that looked like a fancy bedroom on poles. A typical senator's litter was carried smoothly on the shoulders of 8 muscular, highly trained slaves. The litter had thick silk curtains that could be pulled tightly shut, completely cutting the wealthy passenger off from the blinding sun, the choking white dust clouds, and the ugly sights of regular people working for a living, while you were down in the dirt, wiping mud out of your eyes. The senator was floating past you on a mattress of goose feathers, reading a philosophy book or taking a comfortable midday nap. Right below the luxury litters on the social ladder was the absolute steamroller of the highway, a Roman legion on the march. If a commander needed to move 5,000 heavy infantry soldiers to a distant border province, the army took complete control of the road. When a legion approached, you could hear them from a mile away. It wasn't just the stomp of their heavy, iron-studded boots. It was the hypnotic, metallic clink, clink, clink of thousands of iron armor suits and helmets bouncing in perfect unison. When that giant wall of military muscle showed up behind you, you didn't argue about who had the right of way. You instantly steered your cart, your family, and your animals directly into the muddy ditch at the side of the road and stood there quietly, watching a sea of iron spears and red shields march past for an hour. Dodging the market traffic. Down at the very bottom of this moving circus were the regular provincial folks just trying to survive the week. The most common people you ran into were local farmers pulling overloaded vegetable carts toward the nearest market. All my town. These carts were usually piled ridiculously high with baskets of cabbage, sacks of onions, and jars of cheap local wine. Because the farmers couldn't afford expensive mules or horses, the carts were often pulled by a single, sad-looking donkey, or, quite frequently, by the farmer and his teenage kids pushing the wooden frame with their own raw hands. They moved at an agonizingly slow crawl, their bare feet stepping over sharp stones and fresh animal manure, constantly dodging the whips of impatient carriage drivers who wanted them to clear the path. On the Roman highway, everyone was moving toward the same distant horizon, but they were experiencing 2 completely different worlds. The elite glided through the air in perfect, silent comfort, while the rest of the empire fought for every single inch of stone down in the dirt, creating a bustling, sweating, screaming machine that kept the entire ancient world moving forward, 1 painful mile at a time. After weeks of dealing with the blinding dust, the screaming wagon drivers, and the endless straight lines of the highway, the scenery would suddenly open up. The dry limestone plains and thick green forests would give way to a massive river canyon cutting right through the landscape. In the ancient world, a deep rushing river was a terrifying natural wall. It was a place where wild nature basically yelled, "Turn around, you can't go any further." But the Romans didn't really care what nature had to say. Instead of turning back, they built some of the most majestic, mind-blowing stone bridges the world had ever seen, turning a deadly water barrier into a smooth, effortless extension of the Emperor's Highway. As you walked up to a major crossing, your ears would pick up a brand new soundtrack. The loud crunching of sandals on grit was suddenly swallowed up by the deep, heavy roar of a rushing river, echoing off the canyon walls far below. When your wagon rolled onto the actual bridge structure, the noise changed instantly. The solid, dull thud of stone on earth vanished, replaced by a hollow, booming echo as heavy wooden wheels and iron-shod hooves rolled over the massive stone blocks, spanning the empty air. It was a weirdly soothing, acoustic experience. The cool, damp spray of the river rising up to meet you, while the bridge beneath your feet stood as steady and unmoving as a mountain peak. Overcoming wild water. To appreciate how insane these structures were, you have to realize that before Rome showed up, crossing a major river meant risking your life on a flimsy wooden raft or waiting for a dry season so you could nervously wade through a shallow, muddy ford. If a sudden rainstorm hit the mountains 50 miles upstream, the river would instantly transform into a violent wall of brown mud, floating trees and lethal currents that could wash an entire merchant caravan straight into the sea. But when Roman engineers arrived, they brought a secret weapon that completely tamed these wild waters, the semicircular arch. By locking wedge-shaped stones together in a perfect curve, they created a design where the heavy weight of the bridge didn't push straight down. Instead, the weight was pushed outward and down into the massive, solid stone pillars anchored deep into the riverbed. If you were lucky enough to cross a masterpiece like Trajan's Bridge over the Danube River, you were looking at the absolute peak of ancient engineering. This thing was over a mile long, stretching across a wide, treacherous river, using 20 massive stone pillars that rose nearly 150 feet out of the swirling water. Even more impressive was the fact that the Romans built these pillars inside a rushing river. They did this by driving a giant ring of thick wooden stakes deep into the river mud, sealing the cracks with sticky clay, and then pumping all the water out of the center circle using primitive mechanical water wheels. Once the inside was dry, they could calmly lay heavy stone foundations directly onto the bedrock, creating an indestructible base that could withstand centuries of brutal spring floods and floating ice blocks. A psychological monument of conquest. But these bridges weren't just functional shortcuts designed to save travelers from getting their sandals wet. They were massive, highly calculated psychological monuments of conquest. When you stood in the exact middle of a Roman bridge looking down at a roaring, foam-capped river that used to destroy entire armies, you were looking at a physical demonstration of absolute power. The contrast was incredibly stark. Below you was wild, chaotic, unnamed nature, swirling and smashing against the obstacles in its path. Above you was the rigid, mathematical, perfectly ordered stone grid of Rome. Every single block of granite was cut to the exact millimeter, held together by volcanic concrete, and laid out in a straight, unchanging line that forced the landscape to obey human logic. To drive the point home, the entrances to these bridges were almost always decorated with giant, white marble triumphal arches. As your slow ox cart rolled onto the bridge, you had to pass directly beneath a massive bronze statue of the emperor riding a chariot. The message written on the stone wasn't subtle. It told every traveler, merchant, and foreign ambassador that they weren't just crossing a regular body of water. They were walking over a river that had been thoroughly conquered, broken, and tamed by the supreme ruler of Rome. The bridge whispered a simple truth into the mind of anyone who crossed it. If the Emperor can control the most violent rivers on Earth, he can control you too. Entering the dark side of the road. Once you finally reached the far side of the majestic stone bridge, passed beneath the shadow of the Emperor's marble arch and stepped back onto the regular highway blocks, a subtle shift occurred. The awe and wonder of Rome's engineering marvels would quickly fade, replaced by a creeping sense of anxiety about the upcoming evening. The sun was beginning to touch the distant western hills, casting long, spooky shadows across the basalt path. The cool river breeze was gone, replaced once again by the heavy, stale smell of road dust and sweating pack animals. Act 3. The horrors of hospitality. You had survived the long, hypnotic miles of the daily march. You had dodged the speeding chariots and the clanking army legions. You had safely crossed over the rushing waters on an indestructible stone arch. But now, as the daylight rapidly slipped away, you had to face the most terrifying challenge of the entire journey. It was time to find a place to sleep. And in the ancient Roman world, stepping off the open highway and into a roadside inn didn't mean you were finally safe. It usually meant your real nightmare was just beginning. When the last slivers of orange daylight finally dipped behind the jagged pine trees of the Italian hills, the open road transformed from a busy trade highway into a pitch-black, deeply unsettling void. There were no streetlights, no emergency call boxes, and no police patrols out here. If you stayed out on the basalt paving blocks after dark, you were basically volunteering to be robbed, beaten, or worse. So, when you saw a flickering, dirty light glowing in the distance through the hazy evening fog, your heart would jump with a massive wave of relief. You had found a roadside inn, a taberna or a caupona, but as you stepped off the stone path and pulled open the heavy wooden door, that relief would instantly evaporate, replaced by a deep, sinking dread. Welcome to the dark underbelly of the Roman Empire. Hollywood loves to show us the grand, marble-white side of Rome, the glorious temples, the pristine palaces, and the fancy patricians wearing spotless white togas. But they almost never show you the absolute horror show that was everyday roadside hospitality. These places were not cozy boutique hotels with fresh linen sheets, complimentary breakfast bars, and friendly desk clerks. They were gritty, filthy, chaotic dens of misery that felt more like a modern pirate hangout than a place of rest. A sensory assault in the dark. The moment you crossed the threshold, your nose was hit by a brutal, three-pronged sensory assault. The air inside a taberna was a thick, greasy soup of terrible smells. First came the sharp, sour tang of stale beer and cheap, vinegary wine that had been spilled and tracked into the floorboards for years. Next was the overwhelming stench of rancid animal fat bubbling away in a dark kitchen corner, where the innkeeper was trying to mask the taste of rotting meat by tossing it into a heavily salted, unrecognizable stew. Finally, underneath it all was the damp, moldy smell of rotting straw. This straw was scattered across the dirt floors to soak up the spilled drinks, animal mud, and whatever else the guests dropped, but it was rarely changed. It just sat there, fermenting in the dark. The lighting inside didn't help your mood either. Instead of clean burning olive oil, which was way too expensive for a roadside dump, these inns relied on low-quality tallow candles made from melted sheep fat or cheap clay oil lamps filled with smoking, low-grade sludge. They barely gave off any light at all. Instead, they flickered weakly in the drafty rooms, casting long, creepy shadows that danced across the soot-stained walls. The air was so thick with greasy black smoke that within an hour, your eyes would be watering, your throat would be raw, and your face would be lightly dusted with a fine layer of black soot. It was the perfect, moody setting for a classic, ancient nightmare. Outlaws in charge. If the smell didn't make you turn around and walk back into the dark night, the staff definitely would. In the Roman legal system, Innkeepers, caupones, were not respected business owners. In fact, under Roman law, they were legally classified in the exact same low-status category as gamblers, thieves, and gladiators. They were viewed as professional liars and cheats, and honestly, they earned that reputation every single day. The law was so suspicious of innkeepers that if a guest was robbed inside an inn, the owner was automatically assumed to be part of the crime, unless they could prove otherwise. The famous Roman writer Cicero once wrote that when you stop at a roadside inn, you should assume the guy pouring your wine is actively figuring out how to steal your luggage. The legendary poet Horace wrote an entire satirical poem about a road trip he took, and he spent a huge chunk of it complaining bitterly about the inns. He wrote about how the water was so foul it made him sick, how the bread was as hard as stone, and how he had to sit in the dark because the smoke from the inn's fireplace was choking everyone in the room. If wealthy, powerful Romans with private bodyguards hated these places this much, imagine how terrifying they were for a regular solo traveler with a bag of silver coins hidden under their tunic. Sleeping with one eye open. When you finally paid your copper coins to the sketchy innkeeper, you were led up a creaking, dangerous wooden ladder to the upper floor where the sleeping quarters were. If you were expecting a private room with a locking door, you were dreaming. Most tabernae offered communal sleeping spaces. You were given a tiny, cramped corner on a wooden platform, covered in a thin, lumpy sack of that damp, moldy straw we talked about earlier. The moment you lay down, the true rulers of the inn would make their appearance. The bedbugs and the lice. Roman bedbugs were legendary for their size and aggressiveness. Within minutes of extinguishing your smoky candle, you would feel dozens of tiny, itchy feet crawling across your face and arms, biting through your thick woolen tunic to get to your blood. But the bugs were nothing compared to the human threats surrounding you. The walls separating the tiny sleeping stalls were paper-thin, made of cheap wattle and daub plaster that let in every single noise. From the floor below, you would hear the non-stop screaming of drunk wagon drivers playing dice games, shouting curses, and getting into bloody fistfights over a cheated bet. Right next to you, a complete stranger might be snoring like a buzzsaw, while another guest a few feet away could be violently coughing from the kitchen smoke. You couldn't just drift off to sleep in peace. You had to wrap your arms tightly around your luggage, stick your leather traveling boots directly under your head so nobody could slip them off your feet in the dark, and keep one hand resting firmly on the handle of your iron dagger. You closed, your eyes listening to the creaking floorboards and the chaotic shouting downstairs, praying to the little clay statues of your highway gods that you would actually wake up with your throat uncut and your boots still on your feet. After you successfully navigated the creaking ladder to the upper floor, hid your leather boots under your pillow, and made sure your dagger was within easy reach, your stomach would inevitably start to growl. You had been walking or riding at 3 miles per hour since sunrise, inhaling white stone dust and burning through thousands of calories. You desperately needed a hot meal. But as you made your way back down to the smoky, dim ground floor of the taberna, any dreams you had of enjoying a delicious, authentic Italian feast were about to be brutally crushed. You were about to experience the unappealing culinary reality of ancient roadside dining. In the movies, Roman dining is all about rich emperors reclining on fancy velvet couches, eating perfectly roasted wild boars, popping plump purple grapes into their mouths, and drinking fine wines from golden cups. But out here on the highway, regular travelers ate like desperate survivors. The kitchen of a roadside inn was not run by a culinary genius. It was run by a stressed-out innkeeper who viewed cooking as a game of hide-and-seek, specifically hiding the fact that the food was rapidly rotting and seeking a way to make you pay for it anyway. The ultimate Roman culinary cover-up. The moment your food was dropped onto the sticky, unwashed wooden table in a chipped clay bowl, your nose would get hit by a sharp, punchy smell that could clear your sinuses instantly. This was the overwhelming fragrance of cheap garum. If you want to understand ancient Roman life, you have to understand garum. It was the universal sauce of the empire. To make it, factory workers would dump mountains of fish guts, gills, and tiny minnows into giant stone vats, cover them in salt, and let them sit out in the hot Mediterranean sun for months until the fish completely dissolved into a thick brown liquid. To modern taste buds, cheap garum sounds like a biological weapon. But to a sketchy Roman innkeeper, it was absolute magic. Because there were no refrigerators in the ancient world, meat went bad incredibly fast. If a slab of pork had been sitting out in a warm pantry for 4 days and was starting to turn an unappealing shade of gray, the innkeeper didn't throw it away. He just boiled it until it was tough as an old shoe, drenched it in a thick layer of salty, pungent garum, and served it to a tired traveler. The heavy, fermented fish sauce was so incredibly salty and strong that it completely masked the taste and smell of the rotting meat underneath. You just swallowed it, closed your eyes, and hoped your stomach could handle the upcoming battle. The crunch of the highway, alongside your gray, fishy pork, you would be served a side of boiled cabbage and a thick, muddy bean stew. The stew was usually made from fava beans that had been boiled down into a heavy paste, designed to fill your belly as cheaply as possible. It was completely unseasoned, bitter, and thick enough to hold a wooden spoon upright. But the real challenge of the meal was the bread. Roman traveling bread was not soft, fluffy, or warm. It was a hard circular loaf made from coarsely milled wheat. Because the ancient stone grain mills were constantly grinding down against each other, tiny flecks and chips of real volcanic rock would break off and mix directly into the flour. Every time you took a bite of your tavern bread, you would experience a loud, alarming crunch as your teeth smashed into actual bits of mountain granite. Roman skeletons found by archaeologists almost always have teeth that are completely worn down to the gums, and this gritty, rock-filled highway bread is the exact reason why. You learned to chew very slowly and carefully, unless you wanted to lose a molar miles away from the nearest primitive dentist. Vinegar wine and high stakes. To wash down this lovely meal of scraps, you couldn't just order a glass of clean, refreshing tap water. The local well water at these inns was notoriously foul and full of nasty bacteria. Instead, you drank posca. Posca was the fuel of the lower classes, the slaves and the legions. It was made by taking wine that had gone completely sour and turned into vinegar, and then watering it down until it was drinkable. The innkeepers would water it down to an extreme degree, sometimes using 3 parts water to 1 part sour wine, just to stretch their supply. It tasted like sharp, acidic vinegar water, but it had just enough alcohol content to kill the bacteria in the local water supply and keep you from getting horribly sick. It was sour enough to make your face pucker up with every sip, but it was the only safe liquid available. While you were carefully picking rocks out of your bread and sipping your sour vinegar wine, the atmosphere around you would get increasingly tense as the night went on. In the smoky, dark corners of the room, groups of drunk, teamsters and shady locals would gather around low tables to gamble. They would shake small clay cups and slam down dice made from animal knuckles, screaming curses at the top of their lungs whenever a roll didn't go their way. As you sat there trying to finish your cabbage, you would catch the eyes of sketchy figures sitting in the shadows. They weren't looking at the food, they were watching the heavy leather coin purse tied to your belt, tracking every copper and silver coin you handed to the innkeeper. You realized very quickly that dinner was over. You swallowed your last bite of salty pork, left the rest of your gritty bread on the table, and quietly slipped back toward the dark ladder, keeping your hand firmly on your coin purse as you prepared to survive the long, sleepless night ahead. You finally escaped the dark, smoky tavern downstairs, leaving behind the pungent smell of fish gut sauce and the intense glares of the local gamblers. You climbed the shaky wooden ladder, crawled into your tiny sleeping space, and blew out your tallow candle, plunging the room into absolute darkness. You take a deep breath, expecting to finally relax your aching muscles after a brutal 30-mile walk along the highway. But as you close your eyes, you realize that sleep is not coming anytime soon. In fact, you have just laid down directly into a quiet, frustrating, and completely insomnia-inducing nightmare that regular Roman travelers had to endure every single night. If you are listening to this to help you fall asleep, there is a pretty funny irony here. We are exploring the ultimate ancient sleep deprivation experience. The open road was physically exhausting, but the roadside inn was designed to keep you awake until dawn. The moment the light vanished, the quiet night air filled with a very specific, irritating symphony of sounds and textures that made it completely impossible to drift off into dreamland. A texture of pure discomfort. The first thing that kept you from relaxing was the actual bed under your back. In a cheap taberna, you didn't get a nice frame with bouncy metal springs or a soft down mattress. You were lying on a rough wooden platform covered in a thin, scratchy burlap sack. Because fresh straw was a luxury, the innkeeper usually stuffed these sacks with whatever cheap material he could scavenge near the highway. Frequently, that meant dry leaves or rotting, salty coastal seaweed. Every single time you shifted your weight or tried to turn onto your side, the mattress would make a loud, dry, crinkling crunch that echoed through the dark room. The texture was incredibly damp and scratchy, poking straight through your thin woolen tunic and scratching against your skin like a handful of dry twigs. As you lay there stiff as a board, trying not to move so your mattress wouldn't crunch, your ears would pick up the next layer of the nighttime soundtrack. Just a few inches above your head in the dark gaps of the thatched reed roof, you would hear the frantic, rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch of tiny claws. The roofs of these roadside dumps were absolute paradises for field mice and massive rats looking to escape the cold night air. You could hear them scurrying through the straw, fighting each other over dropped breadcrumbs. And occasionally, you'd hear a tiny thud as one dropped out of the ceiling onto the dirt floor somewhere in the dark. The Sick Stranger Concert. To make things even more cozy, you weren't alone in this dark room. Space was limited, so the innkeeper packed people in like barrels of olive oil. You were sharing this cramped upper floor with at least 6 complete strangers, all laid out in a row on the floorboards. Once the alcohol from downstairs started to wear off, the communal snoring concert began. You had one guy to your left producing a deep guttural rattle that sounded like a broken wagon wheel, while a guy across the room was making high-pitched wheezing noises every time he exhaled. Every time you finally started to get used to the snoring, the ambient noise from the bar downstairs would shatter the peace. Even at 2 in the morning, the heavy wooden floorboards beneath your back would vibrate as a drunk wagon driver slammed his fist onto a table, screaming about a cheated dice roll or singing a loud, sloppy tavern song at the top of his lungs. The paper-thin walls did absolutely nothing to block the sound. You were trapped between the mice in the ceiling, the snorers on the floor, and the drunks downstairs. The nightly feast. But the real star of the show, the true conductor of the bedbug symphony, was the physical sensation of being eaten alive. The moment your body heat warmed up that damp seaweed mattress, hundreds of hidden fleas, lice, and bedbugs realized that dinner had finally arrived. It started as a tiny, barely noticeable tickle on your left ankle, then a sharp, burning itch on your shoulder. Within 30 minutes, your entire body was under siege. You'd frantically scratch your arm, only to feel 3 more tiny bugs jumping onto your neck. It was a non-stop, maddening battle. Compounding this physical torment was a heavy layer of paralyzing fear. There were no locks on the doors of a cheap taberna. The entrance to your sleeping space was usually just a dirty, hanging wool curtain. Anyone from the tavern downstairs could walk up those creaking steps at 3 in the morning, slide into the dark room, and plunge a dagger into your chest, just to steal your leather traveling boots or your small pouch of copper coins. Every single time a floorboard creaked outside in the hallway, your entire body would freeze up. Your hand would tighten around the handle of your iron dagger, and you would stare into the pitch-black darkness, holding your breath until the footsteps faded away. You lay there in the scratchy, itchy dark, exhausted but terrified to close your eyes, counting down the agonizing hours until the first gray light of dawn would slide through the cracks in the wall. Moving toward the wild edge, when the morning sun finally broke through the horizon, you didn't linger. You dragged your sleep-deprived, bug-bitten body out of the damp mattress, shook the fleas out of your tunic, checked to make sure your boots were still under your head, and sprinted down the wooden ladder into the crisp morning air. You didn't even look back at the inn. You stepped back onto the rigid, solid stone paving blocks of the highway, feeling a massive wave of relief to be back under the open sky. Act 4. Nature's outer edges. But as you look down the long, straight path ahead of you, you realize the landscape is starting to change once again. The neat farmlands, organized vineyards, and bustling market towns of civilized Italy are slowly beginning to vanish behind you. The road is starting to climb higher, winding its way up into the steep, rocky crags of the mountain passes where the air gets thin and cold. You are finally leaving the chaotic world of Roman civilization behind and heading straight into nature's outer edges, where the highway becomes a lonely, dangerous thread, cutting through a wild world that doesn't care about the laws of Rome. When you left the warm, predictable plains of the Mediterranean behind and headed north toward Gaul or Britannia, the Roman road had to do something that felt almost impossible. It had to cross the Alps. This wasn't just a scenic detour. This was a terrifying, grueling ascent into a frozen, jagged world where the normal rules of the empire simply stopped working. Down in the valleys, the emperor's stone blocks were straight and perfect, dominating the landscape. But up here, nature took back control. The road was forced to twist, bend, and cling desperately to the sides of massive granite cliffs, while the air grew so thin and cold it felt like inhaling tiny shards of glass. The vibe up here was totally different from the loud, sweaty chaos of the valleys. It was majestic, isolated, and overwhelmingly vast. The endless chatter of wagon drivers and the screech of wooden axles faded away, replaced by the deep, haunting howl of the wind, rushing through the deep mountain canyons. It was a sound that made you feel incredibly small and entirely alone, even if you were marching with a dozen other travelers. The treacherous climb. As you climbed higher, the solid basalt paving blocks that made the Roman highway so famous started to disappear. Hauling massive stone blocks up a 9,000-foot mountain was just too difficult, even for the Romans. Instead, the road often narrowed into a treacherous, winding track, cut directly into the living rock of the mountain face. In some places, it was barely wide enough for a single pack mule to squeeze through. This is where the sensory experience shifted from annoying to genuinely terrifying. Every step required intense focus. You could feel the biting chill of the thin mountain air slicing through your woolen cloak, turning your fingers numb. But the real danger was underfoot. You had to listen for the sharp, brittle crunch of unseen black ice hiding beneath a thin layer of snow. One wrong step, one moment of your leather sole slipping on a frozen rock, and you would plummet hundreds, maybe thousands of feet, down into the dark, misty abyss below. There were no guardrails. There were no warning signs. There was just you, a freezing crosswind trying to push you over the edge and a sheer drop into oblivion, just inches from your right foot. If a mule lost its footing and tumbled over the side, you didn't try to save the cargo. You just hugged the freezing rock wall, closed your eyes, and listened to it crash against the canyon walls until the sound disappeared into the mist, begging the mountain gods. It's no surprise that this environment totally wrecked the nerves of even the toughest Roman soldiers and merchants. The ancient world didn't view mountains as beautiful places for hiking and skiing. They viewed them as hostile, cursed zones completely disconnected from civilization. To a Roman traveler, These jagged peaks were clearly the domain of wild, unpredictable gods who hated intruders. Because the fear was so intense, the highest, most dangerous points of these mountain passes became focal points for sheer, desperate superstition. When you finally reached the summit, the exact point where the brutal climb ended and the terrifying descent began, you wouldn't just take a quick water break and keep moving. You would stop at a votive shrine. These weren't grand marble temples. They were usually rough, simple altars built from loose rocks, sometimes featuring a crude carving of a local Celtic or Roman deity like Jupiter Penninus, the god of the Pennine Alps. The ground around these shrines was completely littered with small bronze and silver coins, broken pieces of pottery, and sometimes even small bronze figurines of animals. Travelers who were practically shaking with cold and fear would dig into their pouches with numb, freezing fingers and pull out a coin. They would toss it onto the pile, muttering frantic prayers to the local mountain god, basically saying, "Please, I paid the toll. Just let me get down the other side without sliding off a cliff." It was a primitive protection racket, but it made psychological sense. When you are standing at 8,000 feet, surrounded by swirling white mist, deafening winds, and bottomless drops, you will pay, literally anything, to feel like you have some kind of control over your fate. The long descent. Once the coins were dropped and the prayers were mumbled into the wind, you had to start the descent. Going down was often worse than going up. Your knees would ache with every downward step, your leather boots slipping and sliding on the wet, melting snow as the altitude began to drop. The deep, heavy silence of the peaks slowly began to break, replaced by the distant sound of melting water rushing through the lower ravines. Eventually, the thick, blinding mist would start to clear. The jagged, terrifying granite cliffs would soften into steep, pine-covered slopes. And then finally, breaking through the tree line, you would see it. The familiar, comforting straight line of the Roman stone road picking up again in the valley below. You had survived the wild edge of the world. You were back on the Emperor's path, ready to face the dust, the noise, and yes, even the terrible food and bedbugs all over again. When you finally trickled down out of the freezing, misty alpine passes, you might have expected to slide right back into the sunny, open farmland you were used to. But if your journey was taking you north toward Britannia, or deep into the wild borderlands of Germania, the landscape had another surprise waiting for you. The mountains slowly flattened out, but the horizon didn't open up. Instead, it was completely swallowed by a massive, endless wall of dark green trees. You were entering the Silva, the ancient, untamed forest. The vibe here shifted immediately. It was eerie, incredibly quiet, and dripping with an intense atmospheric suspense. Down in Italy, the Romans had chopped down most of the big woods to build ships, heat public bathhouses, and clear space for neat rows of grapes and olives. They liked their nature, organized, flat, and thoroughly conquered. But up here on the northern edges of the empire, the forest was a giant primeval monster that felt like it was actively trying to swallow the thin strip of Roman highway whole. The psychological terror of the trees. To appreciate how creepy this was, you have to understand the deep psychological terror that ancient Romans felt toward untamed forests. In the Roman mind, a thick forest wasn't a pretty place to go for a relaxing weekend hike or a family picnic. To them, the woods were dark, chaotic places of pure lawlessness. They were places where the civilized light of the emperor couldn't reach. The Roman historian Tacitus famously described the Germanic forests as a terrifying world of gloomy woods and hideous swamps that made civilized people shudder just looking at them. The moment your small traveling group rolled under the first thick branches of a dense oak or pine forest, the bright afternoon sun would vanish. The tree canopy overhead was so thick and tightly woven that it blocked out the sky, turning a sunny day into a permanent, gloomy twilight. And then came the silence. It wasn't a peaceful, relaxing quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The thick layers of fallen pine needles and moss on the forest floor acted like a giant acoustic blanket, completely muffling the normal sounds of your journey. The crunch of your sandals and the creak of your baggage wagon didn't echo anymore. They were instantly swallowed up by the damp, mossy air, making you feel like you were walking through a giant underground tomb. Unseen neighbors in the foliage. As you walked along the narrow strip of stone paving blocks, your eyes would constantly dart left and right into the dense, dark undergrowth. Because the trees grew right up to the edge of the road ditch, your visibility was cut down to just a few feet. Anything could be hiding, just beyond that first row of ancient pine trunks. Your ears would play cruel tricks on you in the dead quiet. You would be marching in silence, and then, snap, somewhere out in the pitch-black foliage, 50 feet away, a dry twig would sharply crack. Was it just a harmless forest bird hopping on a branch? Was it a massive wild boar digging for roots? Or was it something way worse? The list of things hiding in the Silva was enough to give anyone nightmares. These forests were the ultimate sanctuary for people who wanted to vanish from the face of the earth. They were packed with desperate bandits, brutal army deserters who had fled their legions, and local tribal warriors who hated the sight of a Roman tunic. If a gang of highway robbers stepped out from behind the pine trees with iron spears, there was no army fort nearby to save you. You were entirely on your own. Absolute vulnerability. This is where you realize just how thin and fragile the laws of Rome actually were. Down in the grand cities, the law was backed up by massive stone courts, marble statues, and armed guards standing on every corner. But up here, the law was just a 3-meter-wide strip of paving stones cutting through a vast green ocean of wilderness. If you stepped just 5 feet off the stone path into the mossy dirt, you were effectively stepping right out of the Roman Empire and into a prehistoric world where the emperor's name meant absolutely nothing. And it wasn't just human threats you had to worry about. The ancient northern forests were teeming with massive, aggressive wild animals that had long been hunted to extinction down in Italy. Massive gray wolves traveled in large, coordinated packs, their howling echoing through the trees at dusk to remind you exactly who owned the night. Thick-furred brown bears roamed the ridges, and aggressive wild boars with razor-sharp tusks would charge out of the bushes without warning if you accidentally wandered too close to their young. As a regular traveler, you felt completely exposed and hopelessly vulnerable. Your small group would pack together as tightly as possible in the middle of the road, walking in a rushed, nervous silence. Nobody cracked jokes anymore. Nobody stopped to admire the tall, majestic trees. You just kept your eyes locked on the straight line of stone ahead, desperately checking the sky through the thick branches, praying for the moment the dense woods would finally thin out and release you back into the open, predictable, and beautifully civilized world of the Roman sun. Just when you thought you had seen everything the empire's infrastructure could throw at you, from the rain-soaked muddy ditches of Britannia to the suffocatingly silent pine forests of Germania, the Roman road system punches you with a completely different extreme. If your merchant trading route takes you southeast toward the Syrian frontier, or across the vast, sun-baked stretches of North Africa, the scenery undergoes a massive transformation. The dense green trees and jagged gray mountains completely vanish. In their place is a world of endless, sweeping vistas made of nothing but blinding orange sand and jagged red gravel. You have arrived on the scorched tracks of the east. The vibe here is hot, dry, and terrifyingly vast. Down in Italy, the road was a tidy stone corridor that kept you neatly contained. But out here on the desert frontier, the road is a thin, fragile lifeline stretching across a massive ocean of heat. The sun isn't just a friendly light in the sky anymore. It feels like a giant, angry furnace beating down on your head from sunrise to sunset. The sensory trial of the desert. Traveling down a desert road was a brutal test of human endurance. The physical stone paving blocks we love so much were only used near major coastal cities. Deep out in the desert, the highway transformed into a cleared gravel track, bordered by simple stone markers to show you where the official Empire path lay. This is where the sensory elements really start to wear you down. First is the blinding, unrelenting glare of the sun bouncing off the pale sand. It's so incredibly bright that you have to constantly squint, pulling your linen headcloth low over your eyes just to avoid going temporarily blind. Every single breath you take fills your mouth with a dry, metallic taste of fine quartz dust. It coats your tongue, sticks to the back of your raw throat, and makes your lips crack until they bleed. The only rhythm to your day is the hypnotic, non-stop sound of your caravan. The soft, rhythmic shifting of camel pads and mule hooves crunching through loose gravel. Crunch, slide, crunch, slide. It goes on for hours and hours in the dead heat, a slow acoustic rhythm that puts your brain into a weird baking trance. Moving between the forts. Because the desert would kill an unprotected traveler in less than a day, the Roman military set up a highly organized network of isolated desert outposts called centenaria. These weren't grand marble cities. They were small, fortified stone towers built directly over water sources or strategic road crossings. They were garrisoned by a small handful of bored, sweaty Roman soldiers who spent their days staring out at the empty horizon, swatting flies and counting down the days until their deployment ended. To a traveler, catching sight of a centenarium in the distance was a matter of actual life or death. If your map was off by just a few miles, or if your water skin sprang a tiny leak along the way, you were in serious trouble. This is why Roman travelers had a frantic, absolute reliance on local nomadic guides. These local guides knew the desert like the back of their hands. They could look at a seemingly random sand dune and instantly know exactly where a hidden underground well was buried beneath the gravel. Without them, a Roman merchant with a wagon full of fine silver coins was just a future skeleton, waiting to be buried by the next passing sandstorm. Mind games in the heat. Even with a guide, the desert path loved to play terrifying mental games with your sanity. As the afternoon heat reached its peak, the air directly above the burning gravel would start to warp and shimmer. This created massive, hyper-realistic mirages across the horizon. You would look ahead and clearly see a massive, shimmering blue lake surrounded by cool green palm trees just a mile down the road. You could practically taste the fresh, cold water. But as your caravan marched toward it, the water would slowly drift further away, eventually dissolving into thin air to reveal nothing but more dry, baking sand. It was a cruel trick of physics that drove desperate, dehydrated travelers completely mad. You would find yourself clutching your leather water skin, squeezing out the very last drops of warm, flat water that tasted strongly of goat hide, praying that the shimmering shape on the horizon was an actual stone outpost and not another optical illusion. You kept your eyes glued to the footsteps of the camel in front of you, moving forward by sheer willpower, waiting for the brutal sun to finally drop below the western horizon. A shadow of changing tides, but just when you feel like the sand is going to swallow you whole, the scorched tracks of the frontier begin to shift once again. The loose gravel under your boots gradually gives way to harder, more packed clay. The endless dunes on either side begin to flatten out, and the sharp, dry smell of desert dust is slowly replaced by a familiar, welcome scent carried on the afternoon breeze. The rich, salty smell of the sea. Act 5. The return to civilization. You have finally reached the end of the long frontier loop. The wild edges of nature, the freezing alpine mountain passes, the creepy twilight of the northern forests, and the baking sands of the eastern deserts are all dropping away behind you. The road is widening out, matching up with other major highways as the traffic begins to thicken. You can see the neat stone walls of a major Mediterranean port city rising up on the horizon, its grand arches gleaming in the coastal sun. After months of surviving the raw, unfiltered edges of the ancient world, you are finally returning to civilization, where the streets are paved with solid marble, the wine doesn't taste like vinegar, and the comfort of a real Roman city is waiting to welcome you home. You might think that after surviving the freezing, razor-sharp edges of the Alpine passes, the suffocating twilight of the German forests, and the blinding furnace of the eastern deserts, you were finally completely safe. You were back on a heavily traveled coastal highway, rolling through the sunny Italian countryside. The sea breeze was warm, the road was wide, and the stone paving blocks were flat and beautifully engineered. But as you walked along the edge of the road ditch, checking the horizon, you needed to keep your hand tightly gripped on the handle of your dagger, because out here in the quiet countryside, the most dangerous predator wasn't a gray wolf, a brown bear, or a furious wild boar. It was other people. You were about to enter the territory of the Latrones, the highway bandits of the ancient world. The vibe here is all about dramatic but steady, calm intensity. In all the grand speeches delivered in the Roman Senate, the politicians loved to brag about the Pax Romana, the famous Roman peace. They claimed that the emperor had completely tamed the world, making the highways so incredibly safe that a person could walk from one end of the empire to the other with a palm full of gold coins and never get touched. Jacu, the reality of the Roman peace. But if you actually stepped onto the road as a real traveler, you quickly realized that this Roman peace was mostly just a highly effective public relations campaign. The moment you moved a few miles outside the thick stone walls of a major city, the countryside became functionally lawless. Rome didn't have a national police force. There were no state troopers cruising up and down the highways on horseback to hand out speeding tickets or assist stranded motorists. The Roman army was stationed way out on the distant frontiers, guarding the borders against foreign invasions. Unless an emperor or a high-ranking general happened to be traveling past your specific location with a massive personal bodyguard, the long, empty stretches of road between towns were a total free-for-all. This structural absence of law enforcement created the perfect environment for the Latrones. These weren't cartoonish, romantic rogues who robbed the rich to give to the poor. They were desperate, violent, and highly organized criminals. Many of them were runaway slaves who had escaped from brutal agricultural plantations, while others were highly trained army deserters who had fled their legions and kept their military-grade weapons. They knew exactly how to track a target, how to set up a flawless ambush, and how to kill a person cleanly without making a single sound. The glint of iron. An ambush by Latrones happened with terrifying speed, usually in a quiet spot where the highway dipped through a low valley or curved around a thick patch of wild bushes. You would be walking along, listening to the boring, familiar crunch of your sandals on the gravel, completely lost in your own thoughts. And then, your eyes would catch a tiny, sudden flash of movement in the dense foliage just 10 feet away. A sharp, sudden glint of iron as the midday sun bounced off a hidden spear point. Before your brain could even process what you were looking at, 3 men covered in mud and wearing rough burlap cloaks would explode out of the bushes, screaming at the top of their lungs. What followed was a desperate, chaotic, and completely muffled scuffle in the deep roadside ditch. There was no epic movie sword fight here. It was just a brutal, panic-fueled scramble in the dirt. You would hear the heavy, frantic thud of boots stomping on loose gravel, the sharp grunt of a traveler getting hit in the ribs with a wooden club, and the desperate, choked-off cry of someone getting their mouth covered by a rough hand to keep them from alerting a distant farmer. Within less than 2 minutes, the entire struggle would be over, leaving nothing behind but a dropped clay water jar rolling slowly into the weeds. The bandit business model. If you were wealthy and got ambushed by Latrones, You actually had a weird kind of advantage. You were worth way more alive than dead. The bandits had a highly sophisticated business model. They would check your clothes, look at the quality of your gold rings, and instantly realize they could hold you for ransom. They would drag you off into a hidden cave deep in the hills and force you to write a letter to your family, begging them to send a massive chest of silver coins to a sketchy street corner in Rome. But if you were just a regular working-class traveler or a poor craftsman moving between towns, the outcome was way darker. Since your family didn't have any money to pay a ransom, the bandits wouldn't waste their time feeding you in a cave. Instead, they would strip you of your clothes, take your cheap copper coins, and march you in chains down to a sketchy black market slave trader operating in the hills. Because the massive Roman agricultural estates were always desperate for cheap disposable labor, the traders wouldn't ask any questions. They would buy you for a handful of coins, change your name, and send you to work in a deep underground grain mill or a remote silver mine for the rest of your short, miserable life. You would literally vanish off the face of the earth, and your family back home would never find out what happened to you. Safety in the convoy. Because the threat of the Latrones was so incredibly real and constant, regular people almost never traveled down the Roman highways alone. Walking the open road by yourself was basically a polite way of committing suicide. Instead, travelers learned to practice safety in numbers, forming massive, heavily armed convoys before they ever dared to leave the safety of a city's stone walls. Before setting out, you would wait around the city gates for hours, checking for other merchants, teamsters, and travelers who were heading in the same direction. You would all band together into a giant, clanking caravan containing 50, 60, or even 100 people. Wealthy merchants would hire professional private gladiators or tough mercenaries to march alongside their heavy baggage wagons, while regular travelers would carry heavy iron-tipped walking sticks or concealed daggers. When a gang of Latrones looked down from their hidden nests in the rocky hills and saw a massive, tightly packed wall of 100 angry travelers, bristling with iron spears and clubs, they would usually decide it wasn't worth the risk. They would sit back in the shadows, let your loud, clanking convoy pass by in peace, and wait for a lonely, unprotected traveler to come walking down the stone path all by themselves. You have spent the last few weeks marching along the rugged, unpredictable edges of the ancient world. Your tunic is covered in a thick layer of gray highway dust. Your sandals are practically falling apart at the seams, and your skin is covered in a map of fading bedbug bites from that terrible roadside inn. You survived the freezing winds of the alpine passes, the suffocating, creepy silence of the northern forests, and the terrifying threat of the Latrones waiting to jump you from the bushes. But as your heavily armed convoy crests the top of a final rolling hill, the nervous tension in your shoulders suddenly melts away. You take a deep breath, and for the first time in months you smile. The vibe here is all about pure relief, awe, and a gentle winding down of our narrative energy. Down in the wild valleys, you had to be your own bodyguard, constantly looking over your shoulder. But up ahead, rising majestically against the morning sky, is the massive white marble skyline of a grand metropolis. It could be Antioch in the east, Lyon in the north, or the heart of the empire itself, Rome. A sensory wave of comfort as the road begins to widen out, matching up with other crowded regional highways. You experience a massive wave of incredible sensory elements that tell your brain you are finally safe. The harsh, metallic taste of desert dust and the damp smell of rotting seaweed mattresses are completely gone. Instead, the breeze carries the rich, deeply comforting smell of urban, wood-fired bakeries, churning out thousands of hot loaves of emmer wheat bread. Right next to that delicious aroma is the clean, unmistakable scent of burning olive oil and wood smoke coming from the massive public bathhouses. Just thinking about sliding your bruised, aching body into a deep tank of steaming hot water makes you want to drop your heavy travel pack right there on the shoulder of the road. The physical road under your feet is changing too. The rough, cracked paving stones of the empty countryside give way to perfectly flat, beautifully polished slabs of pristine white marble. The walking is so smooth, it feels like a luxury. On either side of the highway, the empty fields are replaced by grand, sprawling stone monuments, massive family tombs, and elegant suburban villas with beautifully manicured gardens. The frantic, nervous silence of the wilderness is officially broken, replaced by the comforting, humming background white noise of thousands of people going about their regular daily lives. Passing through the gates, as you approach the actual edge of the city, you have to squeeze through a massive, monumental stone gate. This isn't just a simple wooden fence or a basic toll booth. This is a giant architectural masterpiece made of solid travertine stone and framed by soaring marble arches. Walking through this gate was a massive psychological milestone for an ancient traveler. It marked the exact boundary where the raw wilderness ended and the absolute, highly ordered embrace of Roman civilization began. Inside these walls, you didn't have to clutch the handle of your dagger every time a stranger walked past. You were back under the protective shield of the Roman legal system. If someone tried to steal your coin purse here, they wouldn't just vanish into a dark pine forest. They would be hunted down by the city watch, hauled in front of a real Roman judge, and thrown directly into a stone prison. The sheer weight of that institutional security made you feel like you could finally let your guard down and just breathe. The end of the path. You follow the main street through the shouting crowds, past the towering columns of the temples and the bustling open-air market stalls, heading straight for the absolute center of the city. And there, standing in the middle of the grand public forum, you find it. A tall, elegant column covered in gleaming gold-leaf bronze inscriptions. This is the famous Millenarium Aureum, the golden milestone, erected by the Emperor Augustus himself. This golden pillar was the official symbolic heart of the entire Roman world. Every single road we have explored on this long journey, every stone block laid down in the mud of Britain, every mountain pass cut into the freezing granite of the Alps, and every gravel track stretching across the burning sands of the Syrian desert was connected directly to this exact spot. It was the physical proof of the old saying that all roads lead to Rome. Standing there in the shadow of the golden column, watching the polished sandals of lawyers and politicians click past on the smooth marble floorboards, you look down at your own mud-stained boots. You realize that the empire wasn't just held together by the swords of its legions or the decrees of its emperors. It was held together by the very stones you just walked upon.
The highway was a giant continental circulatory system that kept the ancient world alive, moving people, ideas, and goods through the wildest environments on Earth. You have faced the worst of it, you survived the ultimate ancient road trip, and now, with the smell of fresh bread guiding your way, it is finally time to find a clean tavern, buy a cup of unwatered wine, wash off the dust of the frontier, and rest. You have finally checked in through the monumental stone gates of the metropolis, bypassing the golden milestone in the center of the crowded city square. The long, exhausting miles of the Roman highway system are officially behind you. Your travel bag is heavy, your feet are covered in deep calluses, and you look like someone who has spent way too much time sleeping on standard roadside tavern floors. But you are not heading to a hotel just yet. In the ancient world, whether you were a high-ranking military commander, a simple wool merchant, or a broke backpacker, there was one absolute non-negotiable rule of returning home. You had to wash away the highway dust immediately. You are heading straight to the public baths. The vibe of this final chapter is ultra-relaxing, incredibly warm, and delightfully sleepy. It is the perfect slow decompression track for our long, epic journey. The busy, chaotic white noise of the metropolitan street traffic completely fades away the moment you step past the thick marble pillars of the entryway. Stepping into the meditative stages. A Roman bathhouse wasn't just a place to get a quick shower, It was a highly organized, deeply relaxing wellness ritual that followed a strict mathematical sequence of temperatures. You started your journey in the appetiterium, which is just a fancy word for the locker room. You stripped off your filthy, sweat-stained wool tunic, handed it over to a bathhouse attendant to wash, and stepped barefoot onto the clean, heated stone floors. First, you spent a few quiet minutes sitting in the tepidarium, the lukewarm transition room. It was designed to gently introduce your cold, road-weary body to the rising heat. The air inside was pleasantly warm, smelling lightly of expensive scented flower oils and wood smoke from the underground fires. As you sat on a smooth marble bench, listening to the soft, rhythmic splash of water echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings, you could feel the tight, defensive knots in your shoulders finally starting to loosen up. For months, those muscles had been clenched tight against the freezing alpine winds and the terrifying threat of hidden bandits. Now there was absolutely nothing to do but sit still and breathe. Sweating out the wilderness. Once your skin adjusted to the gentle warmth, you moved into the main event, the caldarium. This was the hot room, the ancient equivalent of a modern steam sauna. Thanks to the brilliant Roman hypocauste system, where slave crews kept giant wood furnaces roaring under a hollow crawl space, the stone floors and hollow walls were radiating intense, deep tissue heat. The air inside the caldarium was a thick, heavy blanket of pure white steam. It was so intense that it instantly opened up your pores, causing a river of sweat to carry away weeks of built-up exhaustion. You sat in the steamy twilight, watching the condensation drip slowly down the elegant mosaic artwork on the walls. The sensory experience was incredibly soothing. Every deep, humid breath felt like it was cleaning out the dry, metallic desert dust that had been stuck in the back of your throat since your journey through the eastern frontier. Your legs, which had marched across entire provinces, felt delightfully heavy and limp, as if they were slowly melting right into the polished marble bench. The great oil scraping. Since the Romans didn't have modern bars of soap, the actual cleaning process was beautifully primitive. A bathhouse messenger would step up to your marble slab and pour a generous amount of thick, clean Mediterranean olive oil all over your sweaty back and limbs. They would rub it deep into your skin, breaking up the deep muscle soreness from those endless uphill climbs. Then came the magic tool, the strigil. This was a curved, blunt iron scraping blade. The attendant would firmly slide the metal edge along your skin, scraping away the oil, the sweat, and every single grain of gray dirt you had picked up between Britannia and Rome. Watching that gray, muddy sludge drop onto the drainage tiles was an incredibly satisfying psychological experience. It was the physical manifestation of your journey officially ending. You weren't just cleaning your skin, you were scraping away the wild, lawless wilderness itself. After a quick splash of fresh water, you were wrapped in incredibly soft, clean white linens, your skin feeling completely refreshed and smooth. Sinking into memory. To lock the ritual in place, you finished with a quick bracing plunge into the frigidarium, the unheated cold water pool. The sudden icy shock woke up your nervous system, snapped your pores shut, and left your entire body tingling with an amazing clean energy.
You walked out of the pool room, dried off, and found a quiet, cushioned couch in the relaxation courtyard. You lay down, letting your head sink back into a soft pillow. Through the wide open arches of the courtyard, you could see the sun starting to set over the massive marble roofs of the city, casting a warm golden glow across the sky. You could still hear the distant, muffled hum of the great city outside the gates. But it didn't matter anymore. You were safe inside the thick stone walls of civilization. As you slowly closed your heavy eyelids, the long, dangerous ribbon of the Roman highway, with all its mud, ice, sand, and shadows, finally faded into a distant, beautiful memory. Your long journey was officially over. You were home.